We have much to discuss. Let's bring in our panel. From Istanbul, Tanya Goudsouzian is a seasoned journalist who's covered Afghanistan and its leadership for nearly 2 decades. Also with us from St. Louis is Faisel Pervaiz. He's a South Asia analyst at the intelligence firm Stratfor. Here with us in the studio is Omar Samad. He served as the Afghan Ambassador to France and Canada and is currently a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. And John Sitilides is a geopolitical strategist with Trilogy Advisors in Washington, D.C. He joins us from Sacramento in California. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Ambassador, let me start with you. 17 years of war, and we seem to be having this discussion every few months. And the picture is not very pretty. As we heard from our reporter, there's been more attacks, 2 provinces this time, more than 24 people killed. Just before Christmas, 43 people killed, 15 Afghan forces killed on the first day of this year. What is your assessment of the security situation in Afghanistan right now?
I still think that the security situation is still stalemated, meaning that the Taliban have, on one hand, tried and have gained some territory over the last year or so, but they have not been able to alter the strategic equation on the territory itself, or by capturing a major center or holding on to a provincial capital for much longer than a few days. At the same time, I think that we are at a point where the Afghan government is concerned about a lot of issues that are going on, and it's trying to regain territory, and maybe it's in a pushback mode. You can see this by the appointment of several seasoned sort of veterans of the Afghan resistance from the past to high-level positions in defense and interior, and also by the rhetoric that is being used in Kabul, which is one that says we are going to fight and fight hard. On the other side, you also have a lot of talk about working on a ceasefire. And this is coming mostly from the Washington, the American side, where they would like to see, as soon as possible, some type of arrangement whereby a ceasefire can be agreed to by the warring factions.
But still, if we look at the situation on the ground, Ambassador, we just heard from our reporter telling us that Taliban forces now control almost half the country.
Well, they control more or less what they controlled 6 months ago. As I said, they have control over more physical territory, but not more population centers. It's a question of how you weigh the security situation, but obviously they think that they are in ascendancy. They think that they have the momentum that has boosted their morale, and to some extent has created some demoralization on the other side. But I think that we are at a turning point where both sides, on one hand, are talking about talks and peace talks and a political settlement. On the other hand, I think they're gearing up for a big and hard fight ahead.
All right, let me go to Tanya in Istanbul. And Tanya, we heard this announcement from President Trump, the possible withdrawal of 7,000 U.S. troops, almost half the number of U.S. troops currently in the country. We don't know, we haven't seen any plan yet. We don't know whether that's going to happen or if it happens, when it's going to happen. But looking at the announcement itself, how will this be seen in Afghanistan, especially by the Afghan government?
Well, here's the thing. With the U.S.-Taliban peace talks still ongoing, obviously opinion was divided. You had some people who saw this as a premature concession on the part of the Americans, which would have serious repercussions on the ground for security conditions. And then you had others who said, well, this is a necessary move in order to move the peace talks forward. I was just on the phone earlier this morning with an Afghan politician who's actually going to be running for president in April. He's going to be running in the elections. And he said it's absolutely, even though he opposes he's critical of the Afghan government, he finds it ridiculous that the Afghan government is not part of these talks, that decisions are being made that the elected Afghan government is not part of. So in some quarters, this is seen as a defeat by the Americans, even if that's not how it's intended. In fact, there were reports that the Taliban were celebrating when the news came out.
Faisel Pervaiz, how do you see this? Is this announcement by the Americans some kind of concession? Do you see it the same way? The Americans saying, okay, look, we'll take out half our troops, but we want something in return.
Yeah, so this is a really great question, and I would first look at the context. If you look at this war, Of course, this began under President George W. Bush. Then President Barack Obama tried to draw down troops. We remember back in 2011, Obama famously said that the tide of war is receding. And then, of course, you ended up having the NATO drawdown, and there was a high anticipation that the troops were going to come home. Now you're under the Trump administration, and once again, you're still seeing this concerted effort by the United States to try to withdraw from the conflict. I think there was a good point made earlier about the number of troops leaving and what's going to be their role, because as we know, U.S. troops are serving in two separate roles. There is the counterterrorism mission, which is focused on uprooting al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, and then there is the train, advise, and assist mission in which U.S. troops are working with the NATO. So we have to first take this guess that let's assume that the United States tries to pull out the NATO troops. Then the point is that there's still a substantive contingent of American forces there in Afghanistan, meaning that the U.S. involvement may have come down, but the U.S. is still very much involved in that country for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and that is not a distinction, Faisel, that's made very often, the fact that the United States is there in a training and advisory role on the one hand, and then in a counterterrorism role on the other hand. We also heard that, last year, 2018, the U.S. Air Force dropped the highest number of bombs it's ever dropped in Afghanistan since the war began. So what kind of strategy do you see here?
Well, we actually see a two-pronged strategy by the United States that has a diplomatic component and has a military component. Now, we're clearly seeing right now with Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad, the diplomatic envoy in action, strategy in action, excuse me. And this, of course, is a strategy that also involves trying to pressure Pakistan to bring them to use their leverage against the Taliban to bring them to the table. But as a complement to that, back in August of 2017, we saw the United States ramp up the military component of the strategy. Because if you zoom out and you look at the conflict, you're essentially stuck in a grinding stalemate. And U.S. military advisors actually tried to push President Trump to send more troops. Now, we know that President Trump begrudgingly accepted because his general posture is he wants to withdraw troops from these foreign conflicts. So ever since then, as you mentioned, the United States has, in addition to sending more troops, they've also been trying to ratchet up the air campaign. Now, the air campaign in particular is trying to also focus on the Taliban's revenue streams, and especially when it comes to narcotics, to try to target those as well. So we're trying to see the United States really come from these two separate angles to really bring the Taliban to the table. And while we are clearly seeing a momentum building towards talks, the Taliban, of course, have already held several talks with the United States. Right. We're clearly seeing that the fighting on the battlefield has not abated yet.
Okay, let me go to John. John, let's look at the view from the United States. If President Trump does indeed pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, he will be fulfilling a campaign promise, won't he? I mean, this is what he said during his Christmas visit to Iraq when he was visiting troops there. Let's watch.
These people are going to have to start doing a lot of their own work, and they're going to have to start paying for it, because the United States cannot continue to be the policeman of the world. We don't want to do that. We want to protect our country.
So, John, does the president have a point there? Is he really in sync with what American people think?
I think very much so, because in the 2016 presidential campaign, it was both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side who would both state that it's not the job of the United States to be the world's policeman. But I think as we look forward in what's happening in Afghanistan, we need to remove this from the optic that this is solely a U.S.-Afghanistan bilateral policy matter. As a matter of fact, there are very important considerations regarding the interests of countries such as China, India, Pakistan, Iran, and Russia, all of whom have very serious geopolitical interests in the future of Afghanistan. And I think from the U.S. side, the idea that the policy objective here is to ensure that there's no haven, so to speak, for either the Taliban, al-Qaeda, or Islamic State, or any other radical Islamist terrorist group to attack the United States. Well, do we really need to have 7,000 or 14,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan conducting whack-a-mole military operations? You can have safe harbor being given to radical Islamist terror groups in ungovernable countries such as Yemen or Somalia or Libya. So the idea that we have to occupy or be training Afghan forces, I think, needs to be seriously reconsidered. And maybe the U.S. will instead move to a strategy of offshore platforming, using intelligence, drones, airstrikes, missile strikes, and the like to make sure that the Taliban doesn't take over Kabul and run the country in a way that can be very deleterious to U.S. and broader geopolitical interests in South Asia.
What do you make of that, Ambassador? If the U.S. intention, as John points out, is to deny sanctuary to terrorist groups, does it need 14,000 troops in the country?
Well, 14,000 troops are mostly advisors and trainers and mentors and so on and so forth. There is obviously a counterterrorism component, and we don't know if that counterterrorism component is going to be part of any withdrawal in the future or not, because that's an issue that will be discussed between the stakeholders that will be sitting around the table. There is no pronouncement yet from the United States saying that they are going to withdraw fully or when, and I think that this is being discussed at this moment. So we don't have any definitive answer to any of these questions as it's work in progress. Right. But one thing is for sure, terrorism is a threat, has been a threat, and the reason why the United States is in Afghanistan is because of what happened on 9/11, because of the fact that the world had basically ignored what was happening in Afghanistan prior to 9/11, even though there were very clear warning signs. And yes, the world has changed, and maybe the homeland is more secure, maybe other countries feel more secure, but terrorism is a threat that cannot be discounted or taken for granted, and it has to be fought where it is. Now, there are 20 or so known international terrorist organizations, small and large, that are based in or around Afghanistan. And if anyone thinks that that is something that should not be taken seriously, I think they're going to make a big mistake, strategically speaking, let alone the Taliban, who obviously, an Islamic State who has a foothold in Afghanistan now, as we know, but the Taliban themselves have yet to come out and say that, as part of their talks with the United States and others, that they are severing their ties to all terrorist organizations.
Right, as you point out, Ambassador, there is no definitive plan. In fact, a similar announcement was made about Syria, but we've heard in the past, I guess, 48 hours, backtracking on that already. On the question of training and advising the Afghans, isn't there a NATO commitment to do that until 2024?
Exactly. There is a commitment to 2024, but obviously all of that can change if there is some other type of overriding political agreement that everyone agrees to. I don't think that what is important, obviously, for Afghanistan and for the region as well is stability in Afghanistan. Instability obviously has two components: is security as well as political stability. And no one, and I think that with all the different opinions that exist around the table and around Afghanistan, geopolitical posturing that exists, that no one wants to see chaos in Afghanistan. And no one wants to see this situation unraveling and then causing issues beyond Afghanistan's borders.
Right.
So there is commonality, there is a sort of sense of agreeing to making sure that Afghan stability is maintained. It's just a question of how, by whom, and for how long, and how do you find a political settlement overriding all of this.
Right. Tanya, what about a role for neighboring countries? President Trump has complained about the role that Pakistan has been playing. In fact, he said in a tweet last November, and I'm reading this tweet here, he said, "We no longer pay Pakistan billions because they would take our money and do nothing for us. Bin Laden being a prime example and Afghanistan another. They are just one of many countries that take from the United States without giving anything in return. That's ending." But, given what the president feels about Pakistan's role, Pakistan does have a role in resolving this crisis, doesn't it?
Absolutely, but you have many stakeholders. I mean, Afghanistan has 6 neighbors. Each one has its own interests to secure. So it's not just Pakistan we're looking at, but you've got the Iranians who recently had talks with the Taliban. You've got the Russians, the Chinese with their projects, and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia that was about to hold the latest round of talks, and was over the weekend. The Taliban refused to attend those talks because they were pushing for the Afghan government to take part as well. So no, you do have a lot of stakeholders in the region, and that actually is the problem. Part of the reason why why they're having problems bringing peace to Afghanistan is that regional countries are busier securing their own interests than looking at Afghan interests.
Faisel, what are the prospects for some kind of meaningful peace talks? I mean, there were these scheduled peace talks that were supposed to take place in Saudi Arabia. The Taliban pulled out of those talks because they don't want to talk to those particular Afghan government representatives. There's also the talks that will be taking place in Pakistan, and as our reporter told us, their talks will be taking place in Qatar as well. So what can we expect anything coming out of this?
I think Tanya raised a very good point that it is important to maintain a healthy skepticism towards talks. Now, certainly there are drivers that are pushing all the parties towards talks, because we have to keep in mind that obviously the U.S. portion of its involvement in the war in Afghanistan has lasted 17 years, but the war in that country itself had lasted about 4 decades. So clearly there is a war fatigue that is setting in, and the parties that are involved would like to try to create a resolution. But the challenge, as Tanya raised, is that this negotiations process is so tangled that you have to get various parties that have competing interests to try to sit together at the table. Now, we know that the United States actually created a shift in strategy when it decided to take the lead in negotiations. That's where you see Zalmay Khalilzad really taking a lead. However, as we saw in the news here, that in Saudi Arabia, the Taliban themselves said that we are not going to attend these talks. We would rather go to our political office in Doha, Qatar, where we don't have to talk to the Afghans. And if you think about it for a second, as we've discussed throughout this interview, the Taliban right now, although they are involved in a stalemate, they are still launching successful attacks. I mean, just this morning, in a couple of attacks, they killed 27 Afghan security personnel. So from the Taliban standpoint, as from a negotiating standpoint, the idea is that if you're already making so many gains, or at least maintaining your gains on the battlefield, at this moment in time, it actually does not help your cause to try to sit down and talk with the Afghan government, which, by the way, the Taliban views as an illegitimate entity as it is. The Taliban, of course, would rather talk directly to the United States.
Right. John, what is the Pentagon's thinking on a possible withdrawal? I know this is a political issue, but how much of a say would U.S. military commanders have in this decision and implementing this decision? We had a former commander in Afghanistan, Stanley McChrystal, who said that the Afghan people would lose confidence in the United States as a reliable ally if the U.S. announces a date to pull out. We also had, of course, the Defense Secretary himself, a former commander, resign as Defense Secretary.
Well, what we know is that in the United States, the civilian leadership makes the decisions and the military carries them out. However, they can offer recommendations, and as you noted earlier in the program, Anand, when President Obama entered the White House in 2009, he was inclined to pull out of Afghanistan and accepted the recommendations of Stanley McChrystal, General McChrystal at that time, to actually up the forces in Afghanistan, even though they announced a timetable, as President Obama announced to the American people in announcing his new Afghanistan policy. But I think if we look at where we are today, we need to be honest about what the larger U.S. objective in Afghanistan is. And I don't think it has much to do with stability inside of Afghanistan, which has been such a difficult country to govern in the last 40 years. I think the real policy objective here is to make sure the Taliban does not take over the Afghan government and use Kabul as a base to potentially destabilize neighboring Pakistan, which is a heavily nuclear-armed country, which is locked in a very difficult dispute with nuclear-armed India. And the fear is that if you have a destabilization in Pakistan and nuclear arms fall into the hands of radical Islamist terrorists, you have a very, very catastrophic potential scenario for South Asia and perhaps for global security.
If I may, I think that it's not just that particular reasoning. I think that they do care about stability overall in the region. And that stems from stability within Afghanistan, and also making sure that Afghanistan does not become a hub for international terrorism once again, or become a battlefield for proxy warfare that involves everyone, as I said, with different interests or clashing interests. At the same time, I think that the fact that the Taliban would come and take Kabul is probably not such a threat to Pakistan. It wasn't between 1996 and 2001, Pakistan being a supporter of the Taliban. But at the same time, it's a question of how do you integrate the Taliban within the political system of Afghanistan without losing all the gains of the last 17 years that the Afghan people cherish. whether some like it or don't.
Right.
But it's also a question of making sure that that security and political transition takes place at in a certain manner that also would guarantee future counterterrorism opportunities, because otherwise you lose that ability to control the situation as you would in the case of the United States and NATO.
Okay, I've got a few minutes left, Ambassador. There are also talks going on known as the Track 2 talks taking place in China. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I was part of one that took place a few weeks ago in Beijing, and as you say, Track 2 means that it's mostly non-governmental, but most of the people there are people who are closely affiliated to governments. And I think that these initiatives are to seek out ideas and positions. The Americans want to know what the Chinese are thinking right now, and the Chinese want to know what the Americans are thinking, and all of them want to know what the Afghans are thinking, as well as some Europeans who are involved in this particular Track 2. And I think that's very useful because it brings together different viewpoints in a much more unofficial and open setting where people can express themselves more freely.
Tanya, the United States, of course, has a special representative to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad. He's a seasoned diplomat. He's been ambassador there. What is he doing right now?
Well, this is really the question right now. A lot of doubts around what's going on. Part of the concern over President Trump's announcement was that it would reduce whatever leverage Zalmay Khalilzad had to negotiate. When you actually offer the Taliban what they want even before the talks are settled, what do you expect the guy to do? So there's also been criticism over the approach that he's taken. How can you bring peace to Afghanistan by negotiating with only one faction of one group when there are several armed groups operating in the country? So his challenges are many. Where this leads Ambassador Khalilzad, one can only guess at this point.
If I may, I think what Zalmay Khalilzad will have to do now is, on one hand, to make sure that everybody understands that there is no loss of leverage. Right. Number two, that in Kabul, they can cobble together a representative group of individuals who would then form a negotiating team with the Taliban. Right now, the Afghan government says that it's running the show, but others are not accepting, including the Taliban. So this has to be reorganized in a different manner, whereby other Afghan political groups plus the government is involved. And I think that Zalmay Khalilzad will have to go and see how this can be put together in order to get the peace process going. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that he is also very much interested in seeing how you can start a ceasefire negotiating talk on these issues. Okay, and that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.